Hi, this is Mr. Gideon. Another facet of the debate about monetary policy is whether to be an activist or a non-activist with regards to whatever your beliefs are. Sure, there's room for debate about the nature of velocity. Is it constant? Does it change in predictable ways? What about the relationship between the money supply and inflation? If there is this relationship between the two, is it actually proportional? If the money supply increases 10%, is our prices going to increase 10%, and so forth? There's this other piece about whether or not to be an activist or a non-activist. Now, an activist would argue that monetary and fiscal policies should be deliberately used to smooth out the business cycle, and we should have an active hand in the economy with both of these areas. Non-activists argue against the deliberate use of fiscal and monetary policy. They believe in permanent, stable, rules-oriented monetary and fiscal policy. So they're not opposed to monetary and fiscal policy at all, but what they're saying is that based on what they believe with regards to expectations and that whole group of theories, based on other beliefs that they have about how an economy functions, we shouldn't use our discretion like activists do when they notice certain phenomenon occurring in an economy. They should stick to their guns, and they should be very predictable and say we're going to have rules-based fiscal and monetary policy that have to do with what we think the most appropriate tools would be to use in certain situations, whether it's a growth of the money supply of 3% every year, no matter what, or it has to do with automatic triggers in fiscal policy of increasing taxes or decreasing taxes, increasing spending or decreasing spending, depending on what data come in from the economy. What's the case for an activist or discretionary approach to monetary policy? Well, of course, as you might be able to guess, the view is the economy does not always equilibrate quickly enough at the natural level of GDP, and activist policy works, it's effective at smoothing out the business cycle, and is flexible, whereas non-activist policy, particularly in the area of monetary policy, isn't flexible. And so just to be completely inflexible, as the other side is arguing, doesn't allow for the ability of humans to interpret events, particularly new events like we've had unfold in the United States in the last couple of years. What's the case for non-activist or rules-based monetary policy? As you can guess, some of the opposite arguments from what we just saw. In modern economies, wages and prices are sufficiently flexible to allow the economy to equilibrate at a reasonable speed. The long run isn't necessarily as long as people fear. That activist monetary policies may not work, that human discretion is messy, and that these decisions that are made by people, I don't want to say the spur of the moment, but as events unfold, can actually destabilize an economy, especially when you take into consideration the fact that there are lags, both fiscal lags and monetary lags, although a major reason why many people emphasize monetary policy is that they say the lags are much shorter, and that's generally the case. Here's an example of what we're talking about on this side of the argument, that monetary policy can destabilize an economy. If you have a starting point right here, an equilibrium in a recessionary gap, and we want to get to long-run equilibrium, of course. We don't want prices to be artificially high, unnecessarily high. We can miss the mark, especially in light of the fact that the economy can make its own adjustments. And we can go easily from a recessionary gap to an inflationary gap. So all kinds of arguments, all kinds of views and beliefs about how we should use monetary and fiscal policy, whether we should do it automatically, and whether or not human discretion is something that's good or not good. The reality is this social science in particular is pretty messy. Um, we say ceteris paribus, we say all things being constant or assuming nothing else changes a whole bunch, but we all know the reality is that's not how it plays out. The reality in the real world, particularly a huge place like an entire country, and in light of the fact that today's countries are increasingly interdependent economically, it's unrealistic to say that we've got enough evidence here to concretely and conclusively prove that my theory or my belief system is right, because somebody else with a different belief system can come along and say, well, I can look at the evidence a little bit differently, and some of these other events that were unfolding simultaneously could lead to a different interpretation. So once again, to summarize the different belief systems, we have a summary chart here that I want you to know. And now that we're done discussing fiscal and monetary policy, I want you to watch these two fun rap videos that have been produced recently and ask yourself, based on everything you know at this point, again, who do you identify with most? The two videos emphasize the classical theorists and Hayek against Keynes, and Keynesian theory doesn't really talk about monetarists, but in a black and white sense, it's a fun way to kind of summarize the sets of beliefs. And now that you've put the time in and you've looked at a lot of different material and you've grappled with it, it's kind of fun to be able to get the inside jokes and the references where you wouldn't have been able to nearly as much before you went through this material. Keep in mind, though, despite the dramatizations in the videos and all the discussion that we have about argument, that once again the clean little secret is that after several decades now, there's a lot more agreement amongst macroeconomists with regards to monetary and fiscal policy, a lot more agreement than there is disagreement.